am standing at the Mexico-United States border crossing in Tijuana, holding nothing but my driver's license and a receipt for coffee, watching my husband of 4 years drive away with my passport, birth certificate, and every document that could prove my citizenship. The border agent is asking me to step aside while other travelers flow past us into their home country. What my husband David does not know is that the woman he just abandoned has spent the last 6 months building relationships with people who possess the authority to move mountains. And one phone call is about to turn his calculated cruelty into the worst mistake of his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sofia Morales Chin, and at 34 years old, I have learned that the most dangerous prison is not built with bars and concrete walls, but with legal documents, financial accounts, and the systematic erosion of your ability to prove who you are or where you belong in this world. I was born in San Diego to parents who had immigrated from Guatemala and Taiwan respectively, creating a multicultural household where 3 languages were spoken daily, and adaptability was considered an essential life skill. My mother, Elena Morales, worked as a bilingual social worker for San Diego County, helping immigrant families navigate complex bureaucratic systems. My father, Chen Wei-ming, managed operations for a mid-sized importing company that specialized in electronics and textiles from Southeast Asia. Our family understood the critical importance of documentation, legal status, and maintaining relationships with official institutions. My parents had experienced firsthand how quickly circumstances could change for immigrants, regardless of their legal status or contributions to their communities. They taught me that preparation and professional relationships were the foundation of security in an uncertain world. I met David Richardson at a professional networking event in downtown San Diego when I was 28 years old. At that time, I worked as a program coordinator for a nonprofit organization that provided educational services to refugees and recent immigrants. My role required extensive collaboration with government agencies, legal organizations, and international humanitarian groups. I had developed a network of contacts that spanned from local social services to federal immigration offices. David presented himself as a successful, independent consultant who specialized in helping small businesses navigate international trade regulations. He was articulate, well-dressed, and demonstrated impressive knowledge of complex legal and financial systems. During our initial conversations, he expressed admiration for my work with immigrant communities and claimed to share my commitment to helping vulnerable populations access essential services. Our courtship proceeded according to what appeared to be traditional patterns of mutual respect and shared values. David was attentive without being overwhelming, supportive of my career without attempting to direct my decisions, and interested in my family background without making assumptions about my culture or experiences. He integrated smoothly into my social circles and professional networks, earning positive feedback from friends and colleagues who considered him a suitable partner. The marriage proposal came after 18 months of dating, during a weekend trip to Catalina Island, where David had planned an elaborate surprise involving a private dinner overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The engagement ring was tasteful and appropriately sized, reflecting consideration for my personal style rather than excessive displays of wealth. I accepted his proposal because our relationship appeared to be built on genuine compatibility and shared objectives for our future together. Our wedding took place at the Balboa Park Cultural Center, with approximately 120 guests representing both of our families and professional networks. The ceremony incorporated elements from both my Guatemalan and Taiwanese heritage, while David's family contributed traditions from their Irish-American background. The celebration was elegant without being extravagant, and the overall atmosphere suggested a partnership built on mutual respect and cultural appreciation. The initial months of our marriage proceeded according to expectations established during our courtship period. We maintained our individual careers while building shared routines and financial systems. David continued his consulting work while I advanced to a senior program manager position at my nonprofit organization. We purchased a modest home in the Claremont neighborhood and began discussing long-term plans for family and career development. The first indication of concerning behavior emerged approximately 8 months after our wedding, during preparations for a business trip to Mexico City, where I was scheduled to attend a conference on cross-border educational partnerships. I had traveled internationally numerous times for work and maintained current documentation including passport, global entry clearance, and various professional credentials required for international humanitarian work. David expressed unexpected anxiety about my travel plans, citing concerns about security conditions in Mexico City and the potential risks associated with my work in immigrant advocacy. His concerns appeared genuine and were supported by legitimate news reports about increased violence in certain areas of Mexico. However, his suggestions for addressing these concerns involved restricting my travel rather than implementing additional safety precautions. When I proceeded with my travel plans despite his objections, David's response escalated beyond reasonable expressions of concern. He demanded detailed itineraries, insisted on regular communication schedules, and became increasingly agitated when my conference activities prevented immediate responses to his messages. Upon my return, he subjected me to extensive questioning about my activities, the people I had met, and the nature of my professional discussions. This pattern of behavior intensified over the following months, particularly in relation to any activities that involved travel or professional networking with individuals outside of David's direct knowledge. He began requesting copies of my travel documents, claiming that he needed them for tax preparation or insurance purposes. He insisted on joint bank accounts for all financial activities, arguing that this arrangement would simplify our household management and demonstrate our commitment to transparent communication. The consolidation of financial accounts provided David with detailed information about my spending patterns, professional activities, and personal relationships. He began questioning routine expenses and requesting explanations for any financial transactions that he could not immediately identify. This scrutiny extended to professional expenses, charitable contributions, and even small personal purchases that had previously been considered private decisions. His control over financial information evolved into control over important documents. David volunteered to organize our household filing system, claiming that his business experience made him better qualified to maintain important records. He created a comprehensive filing system for tax documents, insurance policies, property records, and personal identification materials. While this organization appeared helpful initially, it also centralized control over critical documents in his possession. The document control became more restrictive over time. David began storing our passports, birth certificates, and other essential identification materials in a safe deposit box at his bank, claiming that this arrangement provided better security against theft or loss. Access to these documents required his presence and authorization, effectively limiting my ability to travel or conduct business that required official identification. When I requested access to my own documents for routine purposes, David developed various reasons for delays or complications. The bank was closed, he had forgotten the key, there were issues with his account access, or he was too busy with work commitments to accompany me to the safe deposit box. These delays were never permanent, but they created increasing dependency on his cooperation for activities that should have been within my independent control. The psychological impact of this systematic restriction was subtle but cumulative. I began to avoid making plans that required access to official documents, partly to avoid the inconvenience of negotiating with David for access, and partly to prevent the conflicts that arose when he questioned the necessity of my activities. This avoidance gradually reduced my professional flexibility and personal autonomy without dramatic confrontations or obvious abuse. My work in immigrant advocacy had taught me to recognize patterns of control and manipulation, but the academic knowledge of these dynamics was different from experiencing them within a marriage that had begun with apparent respect and partnership. The changes in David's behavior were gradual enough that each individual incident could be rationalized as reasonable concern or practical household management. However, my professional training also provided me with frameworks for documenting concerning behaviors and developing safety plans for vulnerable situations. I began maintaining private records of incidents involving document control, financial restrictions, and attempts to limit my professional activities. These records were stored securely outside of our home and David's knowledge, using systems I had learned through my work with clients who faced similar challenges. The documentation process served multiple purposes beyond simply recording events. It helped me maintain objective perspective on situations that David consistently reframed as normal marital negotiations or expressions of reasonable concern. It also provided evidence that could be used to demonstrate patterns of behavior if professional intervention or legal action became necessary. By the end of our second year of marriage, I had accumulated substantial evidence that David's behavior represented systematic attempts to control my access to independence and mobility. The evidence included photographs of important documents before they disappeared into his filing system, records of financial restrictions and interrogations, and detailed notes about incidents involving travel limitations and professional interference. More importantly, I had begun developing contingency plans for situations where David's control might escalate to more dangerous levels. These plans included secure storage of duplicate documents, emergency financial resources, and professional contacts who could provide assistance if I needed to regain access to my legal status or travel capabilities quickly. The preparation process was informed by my professional experience helping clients who had faced similar challenges, but it was also motivated by growing recognition that my marriage had evolved into something fundamentally different from the partnership I had originally agreed to enter. David's behavior was becoming increasingly possessive and controlling, while his justifications for these behaviors were becoming less credible and more manipulative. I realized that I was living with someone who viewed my independence as a threat to be managed rather than a strength to be supported. His concerns about my safety and security were actually expressions of his need to maintain control over my activities and relationships. The loving husband who had courted me with respect and admiration had been gradually replaced by someone who treated me as property to be managed, rather than a partner to be trusted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The recognition of this transformation was both liberating and terrifying. It meant that I could stop questioning my own perceptions and reactions to increasingly unreasonable demands and restrictions. However, it also meant that I was married to someone whose true character was fundamentally incompatible with the respectful partnership I had believed we were building together. The question was no longer whether David's behavior was acceptable or whether I was overreacting to normal marital adjustments. The question was how to extract myself from a situation that was becoming increasingly restrictive and potentially dangerous, while protecting my legal status, professional reputation, and personal safety during the process. I had spent 2 years documenting the problem. Now I needed to begin implementing solutions that would restore my independence and security. The challenge was accomplishing this goal without triggering escalation that could place me in even more vulnerable circumstances. The border incident that would ultimately expose David's true intentions was still several months away, but the foundation for my survival and recovery was already being constructed through careful preparation and strategic relationship building. Every document I secured, every contact I cultivated, and every contingency plan I developed was an investment in my future freedom. I did not yet know that my husband was planning to abandon me at an international border, but I was already preparing for the possibility that someone I had trusted completely might prove to be capable of actions I could never have imagined. The transformation of my marriage from partnership to control required an equally strategic transformation in my approach to personal security and professional relationships. While David was systematically restricting my access to independence, I was quietly building the foundation that would ultimately protect me when his control escalated to dangerous levels. My position as Senior Program Manager at the International Refugee Education Alliance provided me with legitimate reasons to cultivate relationships with government officials, diplomatic personnel, and legal advocates who specialized in cross-border issues. These relationships, which David initially viewed as beneficial networking for my career advancement, would eventually become the lifeline that rescued me from his most calculated act of abandonment. The expansion of my professional network began with my assignment to coordinate a multi-year educational initiative for refugee families who were transitioning between temporary settlements in Mexico and permanent resettlement in the United States. This project required extensive collaboration with the United States Consular Services, Mexican Ministry of Education, and various international humanitarian organizations that operated in border regions. My primary contact at the United States Consulate in Tijuana was Deputy Consul Margaret Chen Williams, a career Foreign Service officer who had specialized in emergency citizen services for over 15 years. Margaret had built her reputation on her ability to resolve complex cases involving American citizens who found themselves in crisis situations abroad, particularly cases involving domestic disputes, document theft, or abandonment by family members. Our initial collaboration focused on developing streamlined processes for educational credential verification for refugee families, but our working relationship quickly evolved into mutual professional respect and personal friendship. Margaret appreciated my detailed understanding of bureaucratic procedures and my ability to provide comprehensive background information that helped her team resolve cases efficiently. I valued her practical knowledge of emergency consular services and her willingness to explain the legal frameworks that govern citizen protection abroad. During one of our quarterly coordination meetings, Margaret shared insights about the most common emergency situations that brought American citizens to consular attention in border regions. She explained that domestic abuse cases often involved one spouse attempting to control the other by restricting access to travel documents, particularly in situations where couples were traveling internationally and disagreements escalated to abandonment or document confiscation. The conversation was professionally relevant to my work with refugee families, but it also provided me with specific knowledge about the resources and procedures available to American citizens who found themselves stranded abroad without proper documentation. Margaret explained that consular services maintained emergency protocols for document replacement, identity verification, and emergency repatriation that could be activated quickly when American citizens faced genuine crisis situations. This information prompted me to ask more detailed questions about the documentation and evidence that consular services required to verify citizenship and authorize emergency assistance. Margaret provided comprehensive information about alternative forms of identification, witness verification procedures, and electronic database resources that could be used to establish identity when traditional documents were unavailable. I also learned about the importance of maintaining emergency contact information with trusted individuals who could provide verification of identity and citizenship status if primary documents were lost or stolen. Margaret recommended that travelers maintain copies of essential documents in secure locations separate from their primary document storage, and establish communication protocols with trusted contacts who could facilitate rapid response in emergency situations. The knowledge I gained through these professional discussions was immediately applicable to my personal situation, where David had systematically gained control over my essential identification documents. I began implementing the emergency preparedness strategies that Margaret had recommended, not because I anticipated abandonment at an international border, but because I recognized the vulnerability created by David's document control. My relationship with Margaret developed beyond professional collaboration into genuine friendship based on shared values and mutual respect. She invited me to attend diplomatic social events where I met other consular officers, immigration attorneys, and international aid workers, who formed a network of professionals dedicated to helping people navigate complex cross-border challenges. These social connections provided me with additional resources and alternative contacts who could provide assistance in various emergency scenarios. I met attorney Rebecca Santos, who specialized in international family law and had extensive experience with cases involving document theft and spousal abandonment. I connected with Dr. James Morrison, who directed a nonprofit organization that provided emergency assistance to American citizens in crisis situations abroad. Each of these relationships was built on legitimate professional interactions and shared commitment to helping vulnerable populations. But they also created a comprehensive support network that could respond quickly if I faced personal crisis. I maintained regular communication with these contacts through professional activities, social events, and collaborative projects that demonstrated ongoing value for all parties involved. The development of these relationships required careful balance between professional networking and personal preparation. I could not explicitly explain that I was building emergency resources because my husband was systematically controlling my access to independence, but I could ask informed questions about procedures and requirements that would help me prepare for potential crisis situations. My approach to this relationship building was methodical and strategic. I documented the contact information, areas of expertise, and preferred communication methods for each person in my network. I maintained regular communication through professional updates, holiday greetings, and occasional social interactions that kept these relationships active and current. I also began storing copies of essential documents in locations that David could not access or control. I established a safe deposit box at a different bank using my maiden name and pre-marriage address information. I created secure digital copies of important documents that were stored in encrypted cloud accounts that David did not know existed. I maintained physical copies of key documents at my parents' home, and with trusted friends who understood the importance of secure storage. The document security measures were comprehensive and redundant, ensuring that I would have multiple ways to prove my identity and citizenship, even if David successfully confiscated or destroyed the documents under his control. I photographed every important document before David stored them in his safe deposit box, and I researched the procedures for obtaining certified copies of birth certificates, marriage licenses, and other essential records from government agencies. My financial preparations were equally systematic and strategic. I established a separate bank account using my professional address and maintained regular deposits from freelance consulting work that David was not aware of. This account provided me with emergency funds that could support travel, accommodation, and legal expenses if I needed to leave suddenly or respond to crisis situations. I also maintained credit cards and financial accounts that were not linked to our joint household finances. These accounts were established before our marriage and remained in my individual name, providing me with financial resources that David could not monitor or control. I ensured that all statements and correspondence for these accounts were delivered to secure addresses that David did not have access to. The combination of professional network development, document security, and financial preparation created a comprehensive foundation for independence that remained invisible to David while providing me with substantial resources for emergency response. These preparations were motivated by growing concern about David's controlling behavior, but they were also practical applications of the emergency preparedness principles I taught to my clients who face similar vulnerabilities. My work with refugee families had taught me that preparation and advanced planning were essential for survival in unpredictable situations. I had helped hundreds of families develop safety plans, secure essential documents, and build support networks that could provide assistance during crisis situations. The strategies I was implementing for my own protection were proven methods that had helped my clients navigate successfully through dangerous circumstances. The psychological benefit of this preparation was as important as the practical advantages it created. Having comprehensive backup plans and reliable support networks reduced my anxiety about David's increasing control and gave me confidence that I could handle whatever challenges his behavior might create. Instead of feeling trapped and dependent on his cooperation, I felt empowered by my knowledge that I had viable alternatives if his behavior escalated. The preparation process also helped me maintain perspective on my situation and resist David's attempts to normalize his controlling behavior. When he claimed that his document control was reasonable household management, I could compare his behavior to the controlling patterns I had observed in abusive relationships through my professional work. When he insisted that his financial oversight was necessary for household security, I could recognize these arguments as manipulation tactics rather than legitimate concerns. My growing professional reputation and expanding network also provided me with increased confidence and independence that David found increasingly threatening. I was invited to speak at national conferences, participate in policy development committees, and contribute to published research on refugee education issues. These professional activities required travel, networking, and independent decision-making that conflicted with David's desire to control my activities and relationships. His response to my professional success was to increase his demands for detailed information about my activities, more frequent communication during travel, and greater restrictions on my networking and social interactions. He began questioning the necessity of my professional commitments and suggesting that I should prioritize our marriage over career development. These demands created increasing tension in our relationship, as I refused to compromise my professional obligations to accommodate his desire for control. I recognized that his demands were not motivated by legitimate concerns about our marriage, but by his need to limit my independence and professional relationships that provided me with resources beyond his control. The conflict over my professional activities reached a critical point when David demanded that I decline an invitation to participate in a policy development conference in Mexico City that would involve collaboration with high-level officials from both Mexican and American government agencies. The conference was a significant professional opportunity that would enhance my reputation and expand my network of contacts in exactly the areas where I had been building relationships for emergency preparedness. When I informed David that I would be attending the conference despite his objections, his response revealed the extent of his controlling intentions. He insisted that he would accompany me to Mexico City to ensure my safety and monitor my professional activities. When I explained that spousal accompaniment was not appropriate for this type of professional conference, he became increasingly agitated and began making threats about the consequences of defying his guidance. This confrontation marked the beginning of the final phase of our marriage, where David's controlling behavior would escalate from psychological manipulation to direct action designed to trap me in circumstances where I would be completely dependent on his cooperation for basic survival and return to the United States. What David did not understand was that his threats and attempts at control had accelerated my preparation for exactly the type of crisis he was planning to create. Every restriction he imposed made me more determined to build comprehensive alternatives. Every threat he made prompted me to strengthen my support networks and emergency resources. By the time David made his final decision to abandon me at the Mexican border, I had spent months building relationships with exactly the people who possessed the authority and resources to respond effectively to his actions. My preparation had been thorough, strategic, and invisible to someone who assumed that I was as helpless and dependent as he needed me to be. The foundation was complete. The network was activated and ready. The next phase would test whether my preparation had been adequate to overcome the crisis that David was preparing to create. The Mexico City Policy Conference invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in early September, delivered through official diplomatic channels that emphasized both the prestigious nature of the opportunity and the international significance of the collaborative initiative. The conference, titled Cross-Border Educational Frameworks for Displaced Populations, would bring together senior officials from multiple government agencies, international organizations, and academic institutions to develop comprehensive policy recommendations for refugee education programs spanning the United States-Mexico border region. My selection as one of 12 American representatives reflected recognition of my expertise in refugee education coordination and my established relationships with both governmental and humanitarian organizations operating in border areas. The invitation specified that participants would engage in high-level policy discussions, contribute to official recommendations that would influence federal funding decisions, and establish ongoing collaborative relationships with their international counterparts. The professional significance of this opportunity extended far beyond the immediate conference activities. Participation would position me as a recognized expert in international refugee education policy, create connections with senior officials who directed major humanitarian programs, and provide access to funding opportunities that could substantially expand our organization's impact and my personal career trajectory. When I presented the invitation to David that evening, his initial response appeared supportive and congratulatory. He acknowledged the professional honor represented by my selection and expressed pride in my achievements within the refugee advocacy community. However, as I provided more detailed information about the conference structure, participant list, and planned activities, his enthusiasm transformed into concern and eventually opposition. David's objections focused initially on security considerations related to travel in Mexico City, citing recent news reports about increased crime rates and specific incidents involving American professionals who had experienced theft or harassment. These concerns appeared legitimate and demonstrated his awareness of current events that could affect my safety during international travel. However, his proposed solutions for addressing these security concerns revealed the controlling motivations underlying his apparent worry about my well-being. Rather than suggesting additional precautions, secure transportation arrangements, or communication protocols that would enhance my safety while preserving my professional participation, David insisted that the only acceptable approach was for him to accompany me to Mexico City as my personal security escort. The practical impossibility of this arrangement became immediately apparent when I explained the conference structure and professional protocols governing participant activities. The policy discussions would involve classified information about government programs, confidential case studies of ongoing operations, and strategic planning sessions restricted to officially credentialed participants. Spousal accompaniment was neither appropriate nor permitted for these types of professional activities. David's response to this explanation revealed the extent to which his controlling behavior had evolved beyond normal marital concern into systematic interference with my professional independence. He argued that my professional obligations should not take precedence over his comfort and security concerns, and that a supportive wife would prioritize her husband's feelings over career advancement opportunities. The argument escalated when David suggested that I should decline the invitation rather than attend a conference where he could not monitor my activities and ensure my compliance with his expectations for appropriate behavior. This suggestion demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of my professional commitments and his expectation that I would sacrifice significant career opportunities to accommodate his need for control. I recognized this demand as a critical moment in our marriage, where I needed to establish boundaries that preserved my professional integrity and personal autonomy. I informed David clearly and definitively that I would be attending the Mexico City conference as scheduled, regardless of his objections or demands for inappropriate accompaniment. His response to my decision was immediate and revealing. David shifted from expressing concern about my safety to making explicit threats about the consequences of defying his guidance and prioritizing my career over our marriage. He informed me that if I insisted on attending the conference without his supervision, our relationship would face serious consequences that could affect all aspects of our shared life together. The nature of these threats remained vague but encompassed financial retaliation, social embarrassment, and actions that would damage my professional reputation. David's language became increasingly aggressive as he outlined scenarios where my independent decision-making could result in circumstances that I would regret for the remainder of our marriage. These threats confirmed what I had suspected throughout months of observing his controlling behavior. David viewed my independence not as a strength that contributed to our partnership, but as a threat that needed to be managed through intimidation and control. His concern about my safety was actually concern about his ability to monitor and direct my activities according to his preferences. My response to his threats was informed by my professional experience working with clients who faced similar controlling behavior from spouses or family members. I remained calm and factual while clearly communicating that his threats were inappropriate and would not influence my professional decisions. I also began documenting our conversations with detailed notes that recorded his specific statements and behaviors. The documentation process served multiple purposes beyond simply recording evidence of his controlling behavior. It helped me maintain objective perspective on interactions that David consistently attempted to reframe as normal marital discussions about reasonable concerns. It also provided me with specific examples that I could share with my professional contacts if David's behavior escalated to actions that affected my safety or legal status. Over the following weeks, David's behavior became increasingly erratic and controlling as the conference date approached. He demanded detailed information about my planned activities, insisted on reviewing my professional correspondence related to the conference, and began questioning my communication with colleagues and government contacts who were involved in the planning process. His scrutiny extended to monitoring my travel preparations, questioning my packing decisions, and attempting to insert himself into logistical arrangements that were being coordinated through official diplomatic channels. David seemed to believe that persistent interference with my preparations would eventually force me to acknowledge his authority over my professional activities and comply with his demands for supervision. The intensity of his controlling behavior during this period prompted me to accelerate my own preparations for potential crisis situations. I increased the frequency of my communication with Margaret Chen Williams at the United States Consulate in Tijuana, sharing updates about my upcoming conference participation and discussing general procedures for emergency citizen assistance in Mexico. These conversations provided me with current information about consular services, updated contact protocols, and recent changes in emergency assistance procedures that could affect American citizens traveling in Mexico. Margaret also provided me with direct contact information for consular personnel who would be available during my travel dates, ensuring that I had immediate access to assistance if unexpected situations arose. I also strengthened my financial preparations by increasing the balance in my secure personal accounts and ensuring that I had access to emergency funds through multiple methods that did not require David's knowledge or cooperation. These preparations included cash reserves, credit lines, and electronic payment systems that could support extended travel or unexpected expenses. My document security measures were updated to include current copies of all essential identification materials, stored in multiple secure locations that David could not access. I also researched procedures for obtaining emergency document replacement through consular services, ensuring that I understood the requirements and timeline for these processes. 2 weeks before my scheduled departure for Mexico City, David announced that he had made the decision to accompany me to Mexico, regardless of my objections or the professional inappropriateness of his presence. He informed me that he had arranged time away from his consulting work and would be traveling with me to ensure my safety and monitor my activities during the conference. When I reiterated that spousal accompaniment was not permitted for restricted policy discussions, and that his presence would be professionally embarrassing and potentially damaging to my reputation, David responded with the most explicit threat he had made during our marriage. He informed me that if I continued to prioritize my career over his authority as my husband, he would take actions to demonstrate the consequences of defying his guidance. The specificity of this threat, combined with his increasing agitation and apparent planning for forced accompaniment, prompted me to implement additional security measures that I had hoped would not be necessary. I provided Margaret Chen Williams with detailed information about my marriage situation, David's controlling behavior, and my concerns about potential escalation during international travel. Margaret's response demonstrated the value of the professional relationship I had cultivated over the previous months. She immediately understood the serious nature of the situation and provided me with specific protocols for emergency contact if David's behavior created crisis situations during our travels. She also arranged for enhanced monitoring of my activities through consular channels that would enable rapid response if I requested assistance. I also shared information about the situation with attorney Rebecca Santos, who provided me with legal guidance about protecting my rights and interests if David's controlling behavior escalated to actions that affected my legal status or access to essential documents. Rebecca helped me understand the procedures for reporting spousal abuse to appropriate authorities and obtaining legal protection if circumstances required intervention. The week before our departure, David's behavior reached levels of control and surveillance that eliminated any remaining doubt about his intentions. He insisted on reviewing all of my conference materials, demanded access to my communication with other participants, and began making arrangements for his own accommodation and activities in Mexico City that assumed his participation in professional events where he was not welcome. His planning activities revealed that he intended to use the Mexico City trip as an opportunity to establish permanent control over my professional activities and international travel. David appeared to believe that if he could successfully impose his supervision during this high-profile conference, he would establish a precedent that would allow him to control all future professional activities that involved travel or networking beyond his direct oversight. What David did not understand was that his escalating behavior had prompted me to implement comprehensive preparation strategies that would enable me to respond effectively to whatever actions he chose to take. My professional network, financial resources, document security, and legal preparations created multiple layers of protection that remained invisible to someone who assumed I was as helpless and dependent as he needed me to be. The final preparations were completed on the evening before our scheduled departure. I confirmed my emergency contact protocols with Margaret Chen Williams, attorney Rebecca Santos, and other members of my support network. I verified my access to secure financial resources and document storage systems. I reviewed the procedures for emergency assistance and document replacement that I hoped would not be necessary but was prepared to implement if circumstances required immediate action. David spent that evening making final arrangements for what he clearly intended to be a demonstration of his authority over my professional activities and personal autonomy. He packed his luggage with confidence that his presence in Mexico City would establish permanent control over my career and international relationships. Neither of us anticipated that within 48 hours his calculated attempt to control and humiliate me at an international border would instead expose him as someone whose behavior warranted official attention from law enforcement agencies in both countries. The trap he was setting for me would ultimately become the evidence that destroyed his credibility and demonstrated the value of preparation, professional relationships, and strategic thinking in overcoming systematic abuse. The departure from San Diego International Airport proceeded according to the carefully orchestrated plan that David had developed over the preceding weeks, though his version of careful planning focused entirely on establishing control rather than ensuring successful professional outcomes. Our flight to Mexico City was scheduled for early morning departure, which required us to arrive at the airport before dawn and provided David with additional opportunities to monitor my activities and limit my communication with colleagues and contacts. During the pre-flight preparation period at our home, David insisted on personally reviewing all of my luggage contents, claiming that his business travel experience made him better qualified to determine appropriate packing decisions for international conferences. This review process provided him with detailed knowledge of my professional materials, personal belongings, and planned activities, while reinforcing his assumption of authority over decisions that should have remained within my independent control. His scrutiny extended to my travel documents and identification materials, which he removed from my possession under the pretense of organizing our shared travel folder for efficient processing through airport security and immigration checkpoints. David explained that his systematic approach to document management would prevent delays or complications during our journey, while ensuring that all essential materials remained secure and accessible when needed. The transfer of my identification documents to David's exclusive control represented the implementation of the trap he had been constructing throughout our marriage. By positioning himself as the responsible party for essential travel documents, he created circumstances where my ability to travel, cross borders, or prove my citizenship became dependent on his cooperation and consent. This document control strategy extended beyond simple possession to include detailed knowledge of my planned activities, professional contacts, and emergency procedures that I had developed through my work with consular services and international organizations. David had systematically gathered information about my professional relationships and emergency resources through months of surveillance and interrogation disguised as marital communication. The airport departure process provided David with additional opportunities to demonstrate his control over our travel arrangements and my professional activities. He insisted on managing all communication with airport personnel, handling document presentations during security screening, and directing our movement through terminal facilities according to his preferences rather than standard travel procedures. His behavior during airport processing created the first indication that our travel experience would involve systematic humiliation and control rather than supportive accompaniment to important professional activities. David spoke on my behalf during interactions with airline personnel, answered questions that were directed to me personally, and made decisions about seating arrangements and service preferences without consulting my opinions or acknowledging my ability to manage my own travel needs. The flight to Mexico City provided 3 hours of enforced proximity where David continued his pattern of surveillance and control while maintaining the appearance of normal spousal interaction for other passengers and airline personnel. He monitored my reading materials, questioned my note-taking activities, and insisted on reviewing my conference preparation materials under the pretense of helpful interest in my professional responsibilities. During the flight, David also revealed additional information about his plans for our time in Mexico City that demonstrated his intention to impose comprehensive supervision over my conference participation and professional networking activities. He had researched the conference venue, identified nearby restaurants and entertainment options, and developed detailed schedules for shared activities that assumed his participation in events where his presence would be inappropriate and unwelcome. His planning activities revealed fundamental misunderstanding of professional conference protocols, and his expectation that I would prioritize his comfort and entertainment over my official responsibilities to contribute meaningfully to policy development discussions. David appeared to view the conference as a vacation opportunity that happened to involve some professional activities, rather than recognizing it as serious work that required focused attention and professional behavior. My attempts to explain the nature of policy development conferences and the inappropriateness of spousal involvement in restricted government discussions were dismissed as unnecessary concern about regulations that could be negotiated or ignored through proper relationship management. David expressed confidence that his business experience and communication skills would enable him to participate in any activities where my professional obligations might otherwise exclude him. The arrival in Mexico City provided immediate confirmation that David's plans would create serious professional embarrassment and potentially damage my relationships with government officials and international colleagues who expected appropriate professional behavior from conference participants. His assumption that rules and protocols could be bypassed through charm and persistence demonstrated dangerous misunderstanding of diplomatic procedures and governmental security requirements. Upon arrival at Benito Juárez International Airport, David immediately asserted control over our immigration processing by presenting both sets of travel documents to Mexican immigration officials and speaking on behalf of both travelers during routine questioning about the purpose and duration of our visit. This behavior required me to remain silent while he provided information about my professional activities and official responsibilities that he did not fully understand. The immigration processing provided the first external validation of concerns I had developed about David's controlling behavior and his potential to create crisis situations through inappropriate interference with official procedures. The Mexican immigration officer directed several questions specifically to me regarding my conference participation and professional credentials, clearly expecting direct responses rather than spousal interpretation of my activities and qualifications. David's attempts to continue answering questions on my behalf prompted the immigration officer to request that each traveler respond individually to official inquiries. This intervention required David to acknowledge that I was capable of speaking for myself regarding professional matters, though his visible frustration with this requirement suggested that he viewed the immigration officer's insistence on direct communication as unreasonable interference with his authority over our travel activities. The transportation from the airport to our hotel provided David with additional opportunities to demonstrate control over our logistics and schedule, while gathering information about the conference venue and my planned activities with government officials and international colleagues. He had arranged private transportation rather than using conference-provided shuttle services, ensuring that he could monitor my communication and control our arrival timing according to his preferences. During the journey to our hotel, David questioned me extensively about my scheduled meetings, planned networking activities, and professional obligations that would occur over the following 3 days. His questions focused particularly on activities that would require my absence from our shared accommodations and interactions with male colleagues or government officials who might provide ongoing professional opportunities. The intensity of his interrogation about my professional schedule revealed his expectation that I would modify my conference participation to accommodate his need for supervision and control. David appeared to believe that if he could demonstrate sufficient concern about my activities and express reasonable objections to specific meetings or events, I would eventually agree to limit my professional engagement to activities where he could maintain oversight. My refusal to modify my professional schedule or provide detailed information about confidential government discussions prompted David to escalate his controlling behavior through explicit threats about consequences that would result from prioritizing professional obligations over marital harmony. These threats remained vague but suggested that my continued defiance of his authority would result in actions designed to embarrass me professionally and demonstrate his power over my career and personal circumstances. The hotel arrival process provided David with opportunities to gather additional information about conference logistics, while positioning himself as the primary contact for our accommodations and establishing control over our room access and communication systems. He insisted on managing our registration process, obtained duplicate keycards for our room, and arranged for hotel services that reinforced his assumption of authority over our shared activities. The first evening in Mexico City was spent in David's systematic review of my conference materials, professional correspondence, and planned activities for the following day. This review process was presented as helpful spousal support for important professional responsibilities, but the detailed nature of his questions and his insistence on understanding confidential aspects of government policy discussions revealed his intention to monitor and potentially interfere with my official duties. His review of conference materials also provided him with detailed information about my professional contacts, meeting schedules, and networking opportunities that would form the foundation for his subsequent actions. David gathered comprehensive intelligence about my activities and relationships while maintaining the appearance of supportive interest in my career advancement. The first day of conference activities proceeded according to the official schedule, though David's attempts to insert himself into professional networking events and policy discussions created uncomfortable situations that required careful management to prevent damage to my professional relationships. His presence at conference social events was tolerated by other participants who assumed that spousal accompaniment had been appropriately arranged through official channels. However, his attempts to participate in restricted policy discussions and classified briefings prompted conference organizers to implement additional security measures that excluded unauthorized personnel from sensitive sessions. These interventions provided temporary relief from David's surveillance, while demonstrating to other participants that my husband did not understand appropriate boundaries for professional activities. The conference proceedings provided me with valuable opportunities to strengthen my relationships with government officials and international colleagues, while contributing meaningfully to policy development discussions that would influence future refugee education programs. These professional activities represented the career advancement opportunities that had motivated my original decision to attend, despite David's objections and controlling behavior. However, the quality of my professional participation was significantly affected by the need to manage David's inappropriate behavior and prevent his interference from damaging my reputation with colleagues and government contacts. The mental energy required to monitor his activities and minimize disruption to official proceedings detracted from my ability to focus fully on the substantive policy discussions that were the conference's primary purpose. The second day of conference activities marked the beginning of David's transition from inappropriate interference to explicit retaliation for my continued prioritization of professional obligations over his demands for control and supervision. His behavior became increasingly aggressive as he recognized that conference participants and organizers were not going to accommodate his expectations for spousal involvement in restricted government activities. The escalation of David's behavior during the second day provided clear indication that our return journey to the United States would involve actions designed to punish me for defying his authority and demonstrate his power to control my movement and legal status. His threats became more specific and focused on consequences that would affect my ability to return home safely and maintain my professional relationships. That evening, David informed me that our departure arrangements had been modified according to his assessment of appropriate consequences for my professional behavior during the conference. He explained that my prioritization of government meetings over spousal accommodation had demonstrated disrespect that required correction through actions that would help me understand the importance of proper marital priorities. The specific nature of these modified arrangements remained unclear, but David's language and behavior suggested that our return journey would involve deliberate complications designed to create dependency on his cooperation for successful re-entry to the United States. His confidence in his ability to control our return travel indicated that he had developed detailed plans for actions that would place me in vulnerable circumstances. The final evening in Mexico City was spent in David's systematic preparation for whatever actions he had planned to implement during our departure. He gathered all travel documents, reviewed our itinerary multiple times, and made several private phone calls to contacts who apparently had been informed about modifications to our original travel arrangements. His preparation activities were conducted with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his control over our marriage, suggesting that his planned actions represented careful calculation rather than impulsive retaliation. David appeared confident that his preparation would enable him to create circumstances where I would be forced to acknowledge his authority and accept permanent restrictions on my professional independence. The departure from Mexico City proceeded according to David's carefully orchestrated plan, though the true nature of his intentions remained concealed until we reached the United States-Mexico border crossing at Tijuana. Our checkout from the hotel was conducted with the same methodical control that had characterized his behavior throughout our stay, with David managing all interactions with hotel personnel while maintaining possession of both our travel documents and luggage. The journey from Mexico City to the border region was accomplished through private transportation that David had arranged without consulting me or explaining the reasoning behind his departure from our original travel itinerary. Instead of returning directly to San Diego through the most efficient route, David had planned a circuitous journey that would bring us to the Tijuana border crossing during peak traffic hours, when processing delays would be most likely to occur. During the lengthy drive to the border, David's behavior demonstrated increasing confidence in whatever plan he had developed for demonstrating his control over my movement and legal status. He maintained casual conversation about the conference activities, while systematically reviewing travel documents and making additional private phone calls to contacts who were apparently coordinating aspects of his planned actions. His demeanor throughout the journey suggested satisfaction with the successful implementation of preparation activities that would soon create circumstances requiring my complete dependence on his cooperation for successful re-entry to the United States. David appeared to view the approaching border crossing as an opportunity to establish permanent authority over my professional activities and personal autonomy, through demonstrated control over my ability to prove citizenship and legal status. The arrival at the Tijuana border crossing occurred during the afternoon rush period, when vehicle processing times were extended due to increased traffic volume and enhanced security procedures. David had clearly timed our arrival to coincide with circumstances that would maximize delays and create additional complications for border processing, though his reasoning for this timing would not become apparent until his actual plan was revealed. The initial approach to the border checkpoint proceeded normally, with David presenting both sets of travel documents to United States Customs and Border Protection officers for routine examination and processing. The officers conducted standard inquiries about the purpose of our travel to Mexico, the duration of our stay, and any items requiring declaration for customs purposes. David responded to official questions with appropriate information, while maintaining control over our documentation and directing the interaction according to his preferences. However, the routine nature of this processing concealed his preparation for actions that would transform a standard border crossing into a crisis situation designed to demonstrate his power over my legal status and freedom of movement. The critical moment arrived when the border processing was completed and we were cleared for entry into the United States. Instead of proceeding directly to our vehicle for the return journey to San Diego, David requested permission to return to the Mexican side of the border crossing to retrieve an item that he claimed to have forgotten during our departure preparations. The border officers explained that re-entering Mexico would require additional processing and would necessitate presenting travel documents again for both departure from the United States and subsequent re-entry. David acknowledged these requirements and requested that I wait in the designated pedestrian area while he completed the retrieval process, which he estimated would require approximately 30 minutes. This request appeared reasonable under normal circumstances, and I agreed to wait in the secure area while David addressed what seemed to be a minor logistical issue with our departure from Mexico. The designated waiting area was located within the United States border facility, providing a comfortable environment with seating and refreshment facilities for travelers dealing with routine processing delays. David departed for the Mexican side of the border carrying both our passports, birth certificates, and other identification documents that would be required for his re-entry processing. His explanation for taking my documents was that keeping them together would prevent confusion or loss during the additional border crossings required to retrieve his forgotten item. The waiting period initially proceeded without concern, as 30-minute delays were common during peak traffic periods at major border crossings. I used the time to respond to professional correspondence related to the conference and coordinate follow-up activities with colleagues who had participated in the policy development discussions. However, as the 30-minute estimate extended to 45 minutes and then to over an hour, I began to recognize that David's retrieval mission was taking significantly longer than reasonable for routine logistical issues. My attempts to contact him through phone calls and text messages received no response, suggesting either communication difficulties or deliberate avoidance of contact. The realization that David might have deliberately abandoned me at the border crossing without essential identification documents emerged gradually as his extended absence exceeded any reasonable explanation for routine travel complications. The systematic nature of his document control throughout our marriage, combined with his escalating threats about consequences for my professional independence, created a pattern that suggested deliberate action rather than unexpected circumstances. The confirmation of my abandonment came when I approached United States border officers to inquire about David's status and explain my concerns about his extended absence. The officers checked their processing records and informed me that David had successfully crossed into Mexico over an hour earlier but had not returned or initiated re-entry procedures. More significantly, the officers explained that David had not been accompanied by a spouse during his departure processing, and their records showed no indication that he intended to return with additional travelers or retrieve other individuals from the United States waiting area. This information confirmed that David had deliberately misrepresented his plans and had no intention of returning to collect me or provide me with the identification documents necessary for independent travel. The full scope of David's calculated betrayal became apparent when the border officers explained that I could not leave the border facility or travel independently within the United States without presenting valid identification documents that proved my citizenship status. My driver's license was insufficient for international border processing, and the coffee receipt I carried provided no identification value for official purposes. David had successfully created circumstances where I was trapped in a border facility without the documentation necessary to prove my legal status, travel independently, or access resources that would enable me to resolve the situation through normal channels. His plan represented systematic psychological abuse disguised as a travel complication, designed to force my acknowledgement of his complete authority over my movement and legal recognition. However, David's confidence in his ability to trap me in helpless circumstances had overlooked the comprehensive emergency preparedness that I had developed through months of strategic planning and professional relationship building. While he assumed that I would be forced to contact him and accept whatever conditions he imposed for the return of my identification documents, I possessed alternative resources that he did not know existed. My first response to the confirmed abandonment was to implement the emergency contact protocols that I had established with Deputy Consul Margaret Chen Williams at the United States Consulate in Tijuana. Using my mobile phone, I contacted the consular emergency line and provided my identification information, current location, and specific details about the circumstances that had left me stranded without proper documentation. Margaret's response demonstrated the value of the professional relationship I had cultivated over the previous months, and the effectiveness of the emergency preparedness discussions we had conducted during my network-building activities. She immediately understood the serious nature of the situation, and confirmed that emergency citizen services could be activated to address cases involving document theft or abandonment by family members. The consular response protocol required me to provide detailed information about my identity, citizenship status, and the circumstances that had resulted in my current situation. Margaret guided me through the documentation process, using alternative verification methods that did not depend on traditional identification documents that David had confiscated. The verification process included questions about my personal history, family background, educational credentials, professional activities, and other information that could be confirmed through government databases and official records. My comprehensive answers to these verification questions demonstrated legitimate citizenship status and provided consular officers with confidence in my identity claims. Margaret also coordinated with United States border officers to explain the emergency citizen services process and establish temporary holding procedures that would allow me to remain in a secure location while consular intervention was implemented. This coordination prevented my removal from the border facility while ensuring that I received appropriate assistance during the document replacement process. The efficiency of the consular response reflected both the professional competence of career Foreign Service officers and the advantages of having established relationships with individuals who understood emergency procedures and possessed authority to implement rapid solutions. Margaret's immediate recognition of my situation and her systematic approach to resolution demonstrated how strategic relationship building could provide critical resources during crisis circumstances. Within 2 hours of David's abandonment, I had been transferred from the border facility to the United States Consulate in Tijuana, where emergency document replacement procedures were initiated using expedited processing protocols reserved for genuine emergency situations. The consular facility provided secure accommodation while verification processes were completed and temporary travel documents were prepared. The emergency document replacement process required comprehensive verification of my identity and citizenship status using electronic databases, official records, and testimony from credible witnesses who could confirm my personal information. Margaret coordinated these verification activities while ensuring that I received appropriate support services during what was recognized as a traumatic abandonment situation. The emotional support provided by consular personnel was as important as the practical assistance with document replacement. Margaret and her colleagues understood that abandonment by a spouse at an international border represented serious psychological abuse that required compassionate response, in addition to technical solutions for legal and logistical challenges. Their professional approach to crisis intervention helped me maintain perspective on the situation and recognize that David's actions reflected his character deficiencies, rather than any failure on my part to manage our marriage appropriately. The consular staff's validation of my experience as legitimate abuse helped counter the psychological manipulation that David had used to normalize his controlling behavior. By the end of the first day following my abandonment, I had obtained emergency travel documents that would allow me to return to the United States independently, established secure accommodation in Tijuana while final processing was completed, and initiated official documentation of David's actions that would be available for potential legal proceedings. More importantly, I had successfully implemented the emergency response strategies that I had developed through months of preparation and strategic relationship building. David's assumption that I would be helpless without his cooperation had been proven completely incorrect through my systematic development of alternative resources and professional relationships. The crisis that David had intended to use for establishing permanent control over my life had instead demonstrated my capability for independent problem solving, and revealed the extent of his manipulative behavior to official authorities who were qualified to document and respond to systematic abuse. His calculated cruelty had backfired spectacularly, creating official records of his actions while proving my competence and preparation. The foundation was now established for David to discover that his attempt to trap and humiliate me had instead exposed him to scrutiny from law enforcement agencies in both countries, damaged his professional reputation beyond repair, and triggered legal consequences that would affect him for years to come. The second phase of my response to David's abandonment involved activating the comprehensive support network that I had developed through months of strategic relationship building within government agencies, legal organizations, and international advocacy groups. While David assumed that his document confiscation would leave me isolated and dependent on his eventual mercy, my systematic preparation had created multiple layers of professional assistance that could respond rapidly to exactly this type of crisis situation. Attorney Rebecca Santos received my emergency contact within hours of my arrival at the United States Consulate in Tijuana. Rebecca's specialization in international family law and spousal abuse cases involving document theft made her immediately qualified to understand both the legal implications of David's actions and the procedural requirements for protecting my rights while pursuing appropriate remedies through official channels. Rebecca's initial response focused on documenting David's actions through official channels that would create permanent legal records of his abandonment and document theft. She coordinated with consular personnel to ensure that all aspects of my emergency assistance were properly documented, including the circumstances of my abandonment, the verification procedures required for emergency document replacement, and the official determination that David's actions constituted deliberate spouse abandonment rather than accidental separation. The legal documentation process served multiple purposes beyond simply recording the immediate crisis. Rebecca explained that David's calculated abandonment of his wife at an international border, combined with his deliberate confiscation of identification documents, constituted several categories of criminal behavior that could be prosecuted under both United States and Mexican legal systems. The criminal implications included charges related to document theft, spousal abandonment, false reporting to border authorities, and potentially human trafficking offenses depending on the specific circumstances and jurisdictional interpretations of David's actions. Rebecca began preparing comprehensive legal documentation that would support prosecution under multiple statutes while protecting my interest during any subsequent legal proceedings. Simultaneously, Rebecca initiated civil legal actions designed to protect my financial assets, professional reputation, and personal safety from further retaliation by David once he discovered that his abandonment plan had failed completely. These protective measures included emergency restraining orders, asset preservation orders, and notifications to relevant professional organizations about potential attempts to damage my career through false accusations or professional sabotage. The speed and comprehensiveness of Rebecca's legal response demonstrated the advantages of having established relationships with qualified professionals who understood the serious nature of systematic spousal abuse and possessed the expertise necessary to implement effective countermeasures rapidly. Her immediate recognition of the criminal nature of David's actions helped validate my experience, while ensuring that appropriate legal remedies were pursued through proper channels. Dr. James Morrison from the International Crisis Assistance Foundation received notification of my situation through the professional network that Margaret Chen Williams maintained for emergency citizen assistance cases. Dr. Morrison's organization specialized in providing comprehensive support services for American citizens who experienced crisis situations abroad, particularly cases involving family violence, document theft, or abandonment by travel companions. Dr. Morrison's response included immediate practical assistance with secure accommodation, communication services, and logistical support for extended stay in Mexico while legal and consular processes were completed. His organization maintained established relationships with reputable hotels, secure transportation services, and local law enforcement agencies that could provide additional protection if David attempted to locate and confront me during my emergency stay in Tijuana. The practical support provided by Dr. Morrison's organization was coordinated with consular services to ensure that all assistance activities complied with official protocols, while maximizing my safety and comfort during what was recognized as a traumatic crisis situation. This coordination prevented duplication of services while ensuring comprehensive coverage of my immediate needs for security, communication, and logistical support. More importantly, Dr. Morrison's involvement brought additional official attention to David's actions from organizations that maintained relationships with law enforcement agencies in both countries. His documentation of my crisis situation created additional official records that would be available for any subsequent criminal investigations or legal proceedings involving David's abandonment and document theft activities. The involvement of multiple professional organizations and government agencies in responding to my crisis created a comprehensive documentation trail that would make it impossible for David to claim that his actions were accidental, misunderstood, or justified by any reasonable interpretation of marital authority or travel logistics. The official nature of these responses validated the serious criminal implications of his calculated abandonment, while providing me with extensive resources for recovery and legal remediation. Margaret Shen Williams coordinated communication between the various organizations and agencies that were providing assistance, ensuring that all parties understood their respective roles and responsibilities, while maintaining focus on my immediate safety and long-term protection from further abuse. Her experience with complex emergency cases involving multiple jurisdictions and legal systems proved invaluable for managing the comprehensive response that my situation required. The coordination process also included communication with United States law enforcement agencies that would be responsible for any domestic criminal charges related to David's actions. Margaret facilitated information sharing between consular services, Mexican authorities, and United States agencies to ensure that all relevant evidence was properly preserved and made available for potential prosecution under appropriate jurisdictions. This multi-jurisdictional approach to evidence preservation was particularly important because David's actions had occurred in multiple locations and involved violations of both Mexican and United States laws. The systematic documentation of his abandonment plan, document theft, and false reporting to border authorities created a comprehensive case file that could support prosecution under various legal frameworks, depending on the specific charges that law enforcement agencies chose to pursue. The professional response to my crisis also included notification of David's employers and professional associations about his actions, creating potential consequences for his business reputation and client relationships that extended beyond criminal or civil legal proceedings. Rebecca coordinated these notifications to ensure that relevant professional communities were aware of David's behavior, while maintaining appropriate confidentiality about ongoing legal processes. The business and professional consequences of David's actions were likely to be substantial and long-lasting, particularly given his work in international consulting, where trustworthiness and reliability were essential qualifications for client relationships. His calculated abandonment of his wife at an international border would raise serious questions about his judgment, character, and suitability for positions requiring ethical behavior and professional integrity. By the end of my second day in Tijuana, the Comprehensive Response Network had achieved several important objectives that demonstrated the complete failure of David's abandonment strategy. I had obtained emergency travel documents that restored my freedom of movement, established secure accommodation and support services that ensured my safety and comfort, and initiated legal processes that would hold David accountable for his criminal behavior while protecting me from further retaliation. More significantly, the professional and official response to my crisis had created extensive documentation of David's actions that would be available for criminal prosecution, civil legal proceedings, and professional accountability measures. His assumption that I would be isolated and helpless without his cooperation had been proven spectacularly incorrect through the activation of resources and relationships that he did not know existed. The effectiveness of my emergency response demonstrated the value of strategic preparation and relationship building for protecting against systematic abuse and calculated betrayal. While David had spent months planning what he believed would be the perfect demonstration of his control over my life and legal status, I had spent the same period developing comprehensive resources that could respond effectively to exactly the type of crisis he had created. The contrast between David's malicious planning and my protective preparation highlighted fundamental differences in our approaches to problem solving and relationship management. David had focused on creating dependency and vulnerability that would force my compliance with his authority, while I had developed independence and resilience that enabled effective response to his most extreme attempts at control and manipulation. The third day of my emergency stay in Tijuana marked the beginning of David's discovery that his calculated abandonment had triggered consequences that extended far beyond his original intentions. Multiple law enforcement agencies had been notified of his actions. Professional organizations had received documentation of his behavior, and his business relationships were facing scrutiny that would affect his career prospects indefinitely. Margaret Chen Williams informed me that David had attempted to contact the United States consulate to inquire about my status and location, apparently expecting to discover that I was still trapped at the border facility awaiting his return with my identification documents. His shock at learning that I had successfully obtained emergency travel documents and established independent accommodation suggested that he had seriously underestimated both my preparation and my professional relationships. David's attempted contact with consular services also provided additional evidence of his calculated intentions, since his inquiries focused on my dependence on his assistance, rather than expressing concern about my safety or well-being following what he could have claimed was accidental separation. His questions revealed his expectation that I would be desperate for his help and willing to accept his conditions for the return of my confiscated documents. The consular personnel who handled David's inquiries were fully briefed on the circumstances of my abandonment and the criminal nature of his actions. Their responses to his questions focused on directing him to appropriate legal counsel and informing him that his actions were being investigated by relevant law enforcement agencies in both countries. This official response provided David with his first indication that his abandonment plan had not only failed to achieve his intended control over my circumstances, but had also exposed him to serious legal consequences that could affect his freedom, professional reputation, and financial security for years to come. His calculated cruelty had backfired completely, creating exactly the type of official scrutiny and legal accountability that he had assumed he could avoid through careful planning and strategic timing. The realization that his actions were being treated as criminal behavior rather than marital disputes or travel complications marked the beginning of David's recognition that he had seriously miscalculated both my resources and the official response that his abandonment would trigger. His assumption that spousal abuse could be disguised as travel logistics had been proven incorrect through the professional expertise of individuals who understood the patterns and legal implications of systematic control and calculated abandonment. Rebecca Santos informed me that David had also attempted to contact her office, apparently seeking legal representation for what he described as misunderstandings about travel arrangements and documentation management. Rebecca's response focused on explaining that her representation of me in matters related to his abandonment and document theft created conflicts of interest that prevented her from providing him with legal advice or assistance. This interaction provided David with additional confirmation that his actions were being treated as serious criminal behavior that required qualified legal representation, rather than simple clarification of travel logistics or marital communication issues. Rebecca's professional assessment of his situation as requiring criminal defense counsel helped him understand the severity of the legal consequences he was facing. The comprehensive nature of the professional response to my crisis, combined with the systematic documentation of David's criminal behavior, had created circumstances where his original plan to establish permanent control over my life had instead resulted in his complete loss of credibility, professional reputation, and legal standing. His calculated attempt to demonstrate his power had instead revealed his character deficiencies to official authorities and professional communities that would hold him accountable for his actions. The completion of emergency document processing at the United States Consulate in Tijuana marked the beginning of my transition from crisis response to strategic legal action against David's calculated abandonment and systematic abuse. The emergency travel documents that consular services had prepared enabled my independent return to the United States, while providing official documentation of the circumstances that had necessitated emergency citizen assistance services. My departure from Tijuana was coordinated through secure transportation services that Dr. Morrison's organization had arranged, to ensure my safety during the border crossing process and return journey to San Diego. The transportation arrangements included professional drivers who understood the sensitive nature of domestic abuse cases and were trained to provide appropriate security measures for individuals who might face retaliation from abusive family members. The border crossing procedure using emergency travel documents required additional processing time and verification steps that were managed smoothly through the coordination between consular services and United States Customs and Border Protection officers. The border personnel had been briefed on my situation and understood that my emergency documentation reflected legitimate citizen services rather than irregular immigration circumstances. The successful border crossing using emergency documents provided definitive proof that David's calculated document confiscation had not achieved his intended objective of trapping me in circumstances where I would be dependent on his cooperation for return to the United States. His assumption that passport confiscation would leave me stranded and helpless had been overcome completely through professional emergency response procedures that he had not anticipated or understood. The return journey to San Diego provided time for reflection on the comprehensive failure of David's abandonment strategy and the effectiveness of the preparation and relationship building that had enabled my successful crisis response. His months of systematic planning to establish permanent control over my legal status and freedom of movement had been neutralized within hours through resources and relationships that demonstrated the value of strategic preparation for protecting against calculated abuse. My arrival in San Diego initiated the next phase of legal and professional response to David's criminal behavior, focusing on formal prosecution through appropriate legal channels while implementing protective measures that would prevent further retaliation or harassment. Attorney Rebecca Santos had coordinated with law enforcement agencies in San Diego County to ensure that appropriate criminal charges would be filed immediately upon my return and availability for official statement and evidence presentation. The San Diego County District Attorney's Office had received preliminary information about David's actions through coordination between consular services and domestic law enforcement agencies. The Assistant District Attorney assigned to review potential charges was Maria Elena Vasquez, a career prosecutor who specialized in domestic violence cases involving international elements, document theft, and systematic spousal abuse. Assistant District Attorney Vasquez conducted a comprehensive interview regarding the circumstances of David's abandonment, the history of controlling behavior that had preceded the border incident, and the systematic nature of his efforts to control my access to identification documents and independent travel. The interview process was designed to gather detailed evidence that would support prosecution under multiple criminal statutes, while ensuring that my testimony was properly documented for court proceedings. The evidence that I provided to Assistant District Attorney Vasquez included the detailed documentation that I had maintained throughout months of observing David's controlling behavior, photographs of important documents before they disappeared into his exclusive control, financial records that demonstrated his systematic restrictions on my access to independent resources, and communication records that showed his escalating threats about consequences for defying his authority over my professional activities. This comprehensive evidence package demonstrated that David's abandonment at the border represented the culmination of a systematic pattern of abuse, rather than an isolated incident of poor judgment during travel complications. The documented history of controlling behavior provided context that elevated the seriousness of his abandonment and document theft, from simple marital dispute to calculated criminal activity designed to control and manipulate through deliberate creation of legal vulnerability. Assistant District Attorney Vasquez explained that David's actions supported prosecution under several criminal statutes, including document theft, spousal abandonment, false reporting to federal agencies, and potentially human trafficking charges, depending on the specific legal interpretation of his calculated efforts to control my movement through document confiscation and abandonment in foreign territory. The criminal charges would be filed in coordination with federal agencies that had jurisdiction over crimes involving international borders, document fraud, and interference with consular services. The multi-jurisdictional nature of the prosecution would ensure that David faced consequences under both state and federal legal systems, while preventing him from avoiding accountability through jurisdictional complications or procedural delays. The prosecution strategy also included coordination with Mexican authorities who had jurisdiction over David's false statements to border officials, and his deliberate abandonment of a United States citizen in Mexican territory. The international cooperation in prosecution would demonstrate the serious nature of his actions while ensuring comprehensive legal accountability under all applicable legal frameworks. Rebecca Santos coordinated civil legal actions that would run parallel to criminal prosecution while addressing the financial and professional consequences of David's systematic abuse and abandonment. The civil proceedings included divorce filings that documented the grounds for marriage dissolution based on extreme cruelty, property division proceedings that would protect my financial interests from David's potential retaliation, and restraining orders that would prevent further harassment or contact attempts. The civil legal strategy also addressed potential professional retaliation that David might attempt through false accusations about my competence, character, or professional behavior. Rebecca filed preemptive legal notifications with relevant professional organizations and government agencies that documented David's criminal behavior while establishing official records that would counter any retaliatory accusations he might make about my professional activities or personal conduct. The comprehensive legal response created multiple layers of protection and accountability that addressed both the immediate criminal consequences of David's abandonment and the longer-term implications of his systematic abuse and control attempts. The coordination between criminal prosecution and civil remediation ensured that David would face comprehensive consequences while providing me with maximum protection from further abuse or retaliation. The professional consequences of David's actions extended beyond legal proceedings to include investigation by business organizations and professional associations that maintained ethical standards for members involved in international consulting and trade activities. Rebecca coordinated notifications to relevant professional bodies that documented David's abandonment and document theft, while requesting investigation of his fitness for positions requiring trustworthiness and ethical behavior. The International Association of Trade Consultants received detailed documentation of David's actions, along with official records from consular services and law enforcement agencies that confirmed the criminal nature of his behavior. The association's ethics committee initiated formal investigation procedures that could result in suspension or permanent revocation of his professional credentials and membership privileges. Similar notifications were sent to business organizations and professional networks where David maintained memberships or credentials that were relevant to his consulting practice. The systematic documentation of his criminal behavior and the official nature of the evidence provided by law enforcement and consular services created substantial professional consequences that would affect his ability to maintain client relationships and obtain future business opportunities. The business impact of these professional consequences was magnified by the international nature of David's consulting practice, where reputation for trustworthiness and ethical behavior was essential for client confidence and business development. His calculated abandonment of his wife at an international border raised serious questions about his judgment, character, and reliability that would be difficult to overcome even if he successfully avoided criminal conviction. The comprehensive nature of the legal and professional response to David's actions created circumstances where his attempt to establish permanent control over my life had instead resulted in the destruction of his own professional reputation and legal standing. His calculated cruelty had triggered consequences that extended far beyond his original intentions and would affect his career prospects and personal circumstances indefinitely. Dr. Morrison's organization provided ongoing support services during the legal proceedings to ensure that I had access to counseling resources, security consultation, and practical assistance with rebuilding independent living arrangements that were not connected to David or vulnerable to his potential retaliation. These support services recognized that recovery from systematic abuse required comprehensive assistance beyond simply legal remediation of criminal behavior. The counseling services provided through Dr. Morrison's organization were specifically designed for individuals who had experienced systematic control and manipulation by intimate partners. The counselors understood the psychological impact of calculated abandonment and document theft, while providing practical guidance for rebuilding confidence and independence after experiencing deliberate betrayal by a trusted spouse. The security consultation services focused on protecting my physical safety and personal information from potential retaliation, while David faced criminal charges and professional consequences that might motivate vengeful behavior. The security measures included assessment of my living arrangements, workplace security, communication monitoring, and emergency response procedures that would provide rapid assistance if David attempted to contact or confront me. The practical assistance with independent living included help with establishing new financial accounts that were not connected to David's knowledge or control, securing new housing arrangements that provided appropriate privacy and security, and coordinating changes to professional and personal contact information that would prevent David from tracking my activities or location. Margaret Chen Williams maintained regular communication during my readjustment period to ensure that consular services remained available if David's behavior created additional international complications, or if his criminal defense strategy included attempts to involve Mexican authorities in disputes about the circumstances of his abandonment. Her continued involvement provided reassurance that professional resources remained accessible if the situation escalated beyond domestic legal proceedings. The ongoing support from multiple professional and government organizations demonstrated the effectiveness of strategic relationship building for creating comprehensive protection against systematic abuse and calculated betrayal. The network of resources that had enabled my successful crisis response continued to provide security and assistance during the legal and personal recovery process. Within 2 weeks of my return to San Diego, the comprehensive legal and professional response to David's actions had achieved several important objectives that validated the effectiveness of preparation and strategic relationship building for overcoming calculated abuse. Criminal charges had been filed under multiple statutes that addressed the serious nature of his abandonment and document theft. Civil legal proceedings had been initiated to protect my financial interests and prevent further harassment, and professional organizations had begun investigation procedures that would affect his business reputation and career prospects. More importantly, the systematic documentation of David's criminal behavior and the professional response to his actions had created permanent official records that would be available for future legal proceedings, professional investigations, and security assessments. His calculated attempt to demonstrate control over my life had instead generated comprehensive evidence of his character deficiencies and criminal behavior that would follow him indefinitely. The contrast between David's malicious planning and the professional response to his actions highlighted the fundamental difference between destructive manipulation and constructive preparation. While David had focused on creating vulnerability and dependence that would force my compliance with his authority, I had developed resilience and resources that enabled effective response to his most extreme attempts at control and provided comprehensive protection during the recovery process. The comprehensive legal and professional consequences that resulted from David's calculated abandonment began to materialize with systematic precision during the weeks following my return to San Diego. His initial confidence that his document confiscation strategy would establish permanent control over my circumstances was replaced by growing recognition that his actions had triggered consequences extending far beyond his original intentions and completely outside his ability to manage or contain. David's first indication of the serious legal implications of his abandonment came through formal notification from the San Diego County District Attorney's Office that criminal charges were being filed against him under multiple statutes. The charges included document theft, spousal abandonment, making false statements to federal officials, and conspiracy to commit human trafficking through deliberate creation of circumstances designed to control another person's movement through document confiscation and abandonment in foreign territory. The criminal charge notification was delivered through certified mail to David's business address and personal residence, ensuring that he received official notice of the legal proceedings while creating documented evidence of proper notification procedures. The formal nature of the charge notification eliminated any possibility that David could claim ignorance of the legal consequences of his actions, or surprise at the prosecutorial response to his calculated abandonment. Assistant District Attorney Maria Elena Vasquez had structured the criminal charges to reflect the systematic nature of David's controlling behavior and the calculated planning that had preceded his abandonment at the border crossing. The prosecution strategy focused on demonstrating that David's actions represented deliberate criminal activity rather than impulsive poor judgment during travel complications, which significantly increased the potential penalties and reduced his options for plea negotiation or charge reduction. The criminal charges were accompanied by detailed evidence packages that documented David's history of controlling behavior, his systematic efforts to restrict my access to identification documents, and the specific actions he had taken to create circumstances where I would be trapped without proper documentation at an international border. This comprehensive evidence presentation demonstrated the prosecution's thorough preparation and serious commitment to holding David accountable for his criminal behavior. David's attempts to obtain legal representation for the criminal charges revealed the extent to which his professional reputation had been damaged by the official documentation of his actions. Several attorneys declined to represent him after reviewing the evidence package and recognizing the serious nature of the charges, particularly the international elements that could involve federal prosecution and potential immigration consequences for his business activities. The difficulty in obtaining qualified legal representation was compounded by the professional notifications that Rebecca Santos had coordinated with relevant business organizations and trade associations. These notifications had created awareness within the legal community about David's actions and their implications for his character and trustworthiness, making attorneys reluctant to associate their professional reputations with defending someone whose behavior raised serious ethical concerns. When David finally secured legal representation through attorney Michael Thompson, a criminal defense specialist who accepted difficult cases involving domestic violence and international complications, the initial case assessment revealed the limited options available for defending against the comprehensive evidence that the prosecution had assembled. Attorney Thompson's preliminary review confirmed that the criminal charges were well supported by documented evidence and witness testimony that would be difficult to challenge effectively in court proceedings. The federal component of David's legal troubles emerged when the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of California initiated parallel prosecution under federal statutes related to document fraud, false statements to federal agencies, and interference with consular services. The federal charges carried more severe penalties than the state criminal proceedings and involved agencies with greater investigative resources and prosecutorial experience in complex international cases. The federal prosecution was coordinated with the Border Patrol Investigation Unit that had reviewed David's false statements during the border crossing process and determined that his deliberate misrepresentation of his intentions constituted criminal fraud against federal agencies. The investigation revealed that David had provided false information about his travel plans, his intentions regarding my status, and his reasons for crossing back into Mexico with both sets of travel documents. The Border Patrol investigation also uncovered additional evidence of David's calculated planning through analysis of his communication records, travel arrangements, and financial transactions related to the Mexico City trip. This evidence demonstrated that David's abandonment was premeditated rather than impulsive, which supported the prosecution's argument that his actions constituted serious criminal behavior warranting substantial penalties. The international cooperation component of David's legal troubles involved coordination between United States and Mexican authorities regarding his false statements to border officials in both countries and his deliberate abandonment of a United States citizen in Mexican territory. The Mexican authorities were pursuing their own investigation into David's actions under statutes related to false reporting and creating public danger through abandonment of individuals without proper documentation. The multi-jurisdictional nature of the legal proceedings created complex coordination requirements that Attorney Thompson struggled to manage effectively. The simultaneous prosecution under state, federal, and international jurisdictions created multiple legal proceedings with different procedural requirements, evidence standards, and potential penalties that made comprehensive defense strategy development extremely challenging and expensive. David's professional consequences escalated when the International Association of Trade Consultants completed their ethics investigation and determined that his calculated abandonment of his spouse at an international border constituted conduct incompatible with professional membership standards. The association's ethics committee voted unanimously to revoke David's professional credentials and terminate his membership privileges indefinitely, effectively ending his ability to maintain professional standing within his primary industry organization. The professional sanctions extended to other business organizations and trade associations, where David held memberships or credentials relevant to his consulting practice. The systematic documentation of his criminal behavior and the official nature of the evidence provided by law enforcement agencies created grounds for ethics investigations that resulted in suspension or termination of professional privileges across multiple organizations. The cumulative effect of these professional sanctions was to eliminate David's ability to maintain the professional relationships and credentials that were essential for his international consulting business. His clients began terminating contracts and refusing to renew agreements once they became aware of the criminal charges and professional sanctions that raised serious questions about his trustworthiness and reliability. The financial impact of David's legal troubles was magnified by the civil proceedings that Rebecca Santos had initiated to protect my interests and seek appropriate remediation for the economic damages caused by his systematic abuse and abandonment. The civil litigation included claims for emotional distress, professional interference, economic harm, and punitive damages that reflected the calculated nature of his controlling behavior and criminal actions. The civil proceedings also included asset preservation measures that prevented David from disposing of marital property or business assets that might be needed to satisfy judgment awards or legal expenses. These protective measures ensured that financial resources would be available for appropriate compensation, while preventing David from avoiding accountability through asset transfer or business restructuring. Rebecca Santos coordinated the civil litigation strategy with the criminal prosecution to ensure that the proceedings supported each other while maximizing the legal consequences for David's behavior. The coordination between civil and criminal proceedings created comprehensive accountability that addressed both the immediate criminal behavior and the broader pattern of systematic abuse that had preceded the border abandonment incident. David's attempts to minimize the damage to his reputation and business relationships through public relations efforts and direct communication with former clients and professional contacts proved largely ineffective due to the official nature of the criminal charges and the documented evidence of his behavior. His explanations that the charges resulted from marital disputes or misunderstandings were contradicted by the systematic evidence that prosecution agencies had assembled and the professional investigations that had confirmed the serious nature of his actions. The public nature of criminal proceedings meant that information about David's charges and the circumstances of his abandonment became available through court records and legal databases that potential clients and business partners could access during routine background investigations. This transparency eliminated his ability to conceal or minimize the legal consequences of his actions when pursuing new business opportunities or professional relationships. David's attempts to contact me directly to negotiate resolution of the legal proceedings were blocked by the restraining orders that Rebecca Santos had obtained and monitored by law enforcement agencies that were investigating his compliance with court-ordered restrictions on contact and harassment. These protective measures ensured that David could not use intimidation or manipulation to influence my cooperation with prosecution efforts or pressure me to minimize his legal consequences. The comprehensive nature of the legal and professional consequences that David faced created circumstances where his original plan to establish permanent control over my life had instead resulted in the complete destruction of his own professional standing and legal security. His calculated cruelty had generated consequences that would affect his career prospects, financial stability, and personal reputation for years to come, while providing me with comprehensive protection and appropriate remediation for his systematic abuse. The contrast between David's confident planning for my humiliation and dependence and the reality of his comprehensive legal and professional downfall demonstrated the fundamental principle that calculated abuse and criminal behavior ultimately create consequences for perpetrators rather than permanent control over victims. His assumption that I would be helpless without his cooperation had been proven spectacularly incorrect through the activation of resources and relationships that he had never anticipated or understood. The systematic documentation of David's controlling behavior and criminal actions had created permanent official records that would follow him indefinitely, affecting his ability to obtain professional credentials, maintain business relationships, or avoid scrutiny during background investigations for future opportunities. His moment of calculated cruelty had become a permanent marker of his character and judgment that would influence how others evaluated his trustworthiness and reliability. The effectiveness of my strategic preparation and relationship building in overcoming David's abandonment and creating comprehensive accountability for his actions validated the importance of proactive planning and professional network development for protecting against systematic abuse. The resources that had enabled my successful crisis response continued to provide security and support during the legal proceedings, while ensuring that David faced appropriate consequences for his calculated betrayal and criminal behavior. The formal commencement of legal proceedings against David represented a critical transition from crisis response to systematic accountability through established judicial processes. Assistant District Attorney Maria Elena Vasquez had structured the prosecution strategy to demonstrate the calculated nature of David's abandonment, while establishing clear precedent for future cases involving systematic spousal abuse through document control and international abandonment tactics. The prosecution's case presentation began with comprehensive documentation of David's controlling behavior patterns that had preceded the border incident. The evidence included detailed records of his systematic restriction of my access to identification documents, financial surveillance and control mechanisms, professional interference activities, and explicit threats about consequences for defying his authority over my career and travel activities. The systematic nature of this evidence demonstrated that David's abandonment was not an isolated incident of poor judgment during travel complications, but rather the culmination of a deliberate campaign to establish complete control over my legal status and freedom of movement. The prosecution's narrative showed how each element of David's controlling behavior had contributed to creating circumstances where he believed he could abandon me with impunity while forcing my dependence on his cooperation for basic survival and return to the United States. The testimony phase of the criminal proceedings included detailed statements from consular personnel who had responded to my emergency situation, law enforcement officers who had investigated David's false statements to border authorities, and professional colleagues who had witnessed his inappropriate attempts to interfere with my conference participation and official duties. These testimonies provided objective validation of the systematic nature of David's abuse and the serious professional consequences of his behavior. Margaret Chen Williams provided expert testimony regarding emergency consular services for abandoned spouses and the procedures that were required to verify my citizenship status and authorize emergency document replacement. Her testimony established the official recognition that David's actions constituted deliberate spouse abandonment rather than accidental separation, while demonstrating the systematic nature of the emergency response that had been necessary to address his calculated cruelty. Dr. James Morrison testified regarding the psychological impact of calculated abandonment and the specialized support services that were required for individuals who had experienced systematic control and manipulation by intimate partners. His testimony provided professional context for understanding the serious emotional harm that David's actions had created, while validating the comprehensive nature of the support services that had been necessary for my recovery and protection. Rebecca Santos provided testimony regarding the civil legal implications of David's actions and the systematic approach that had been required to protect my financial interests and personal safety from further retaliation. Her testimony established the professional legal assessment that David's behavior warranted comprehensive protective measures and civil remediation beyond simple criminal prosecution. The prosecution's presentation of financial evidence demonstrated how David had used systematic control over banking access and document possession to create economic dependency that supported his overall strategy for controlling my independence and professional activities. The financial evidence showed how economic manipulation had been integrated with document control and psychological intimidation to create comprehensive circumstances designed to prevent my ability to leave or resist his authority. The defense strategy developed by attorney Michael Thompson attempted to minimize David's criminal culpability by characterizing his actions as misguided attempts to protect his marriage, rather than calculated criminal behavior designed to control and manipulate through systematic abuse. The defense argued that David's controlling behavior reflected normal marital concerns that had escalated due to communication problems, rather than representing deliberate criminal activity warranting serious legal penalties. However, the defense strategy was undermined by the systematic nature of the evidence that the prosecution had assembled and the official documentation from multiple government agencies that confirmed the calculated nature of David's abandonment. The comprehensive evidence package made it impossible to characterize David's actions as impulsive emotional responses or reasonable protective measures, rather than deliberate criminal behavior. The federal prosecution component added additional complexity to the legal proceedings while providing stronger evidence of David's criminal intent and the serious nature of his actions. The federal charges focused on David's false statements to border authorities and his deliberate interference with consular services through his abandonment tactics, which carried substantial penalties and involved agencies with extensive investigative resources. The federal investigation had uncovered additional evidence of David's premeditation through analysis of his communication records, financial transactions, and travel arrangements that demonstrated systematic planning for the abandonment rather than spontaneous poor judgment during travel complications. This evidence provided strong support for the prosecution's argument that David's actions warranted serious criminal penalties rather than minimal consequences for domestic disputes. The international cooperation component of the legal proceedings involved coordination with Mexican authorities who were pursuing their own investigation into David's false statements and abandonment activities. The Mexican investigation provided additional evidence of David's deliberate deception and created potential for additional criminal consequences under Mexican jurisdiction that would affect his ability to travel internationally in the future. The civil litigation proceedings advanced simultaneously with the criminal prosecution, while addressing the broader financial and personal consequences of David's systematic abuse and abandonment. Rebecca Santos had structured the civil case to seek comprehensive compensation for the economic damages, professional interference, emotional distress, and punitive damages that reflected the calculated nature of David's controlling behavior. The civil discovery process revealed additional evidence of David's systematic financial manipulation and document control that supported both the civil claims and the criminal prosecution. The financial records obtained through civil discovery showed how David had used banking access restrictions and document control to create economic dependency, while gathering intelligence about my professional activities and personal relationships. The asset preservation measures that had been implemented through the civil proceedings ensured that David's business assets and marital property remained available to satisfy potential judgment awards while preventing him from avoiding financial accountability through asset transfer or business restructuring. These protective measures provided security for appropriate compensation while demonstrating the serious financial consequences of his calculated abuse. During this period of intensive legal proceedings, I focused on rebuilding independent living arrangements and professional relationships that were secure from David's knowledge or potential retaliation. The transition to independent living required systematic changes to financial accounts, professional contacts, residential arrangements, and communication systems that would provide comprehensive security while enabling me to resume normal professional and personal activities. The financial reconstruction process involved establishing new banking relationships, credit accounts, and investment arrangements that were completely separate from David's knowledge or control. These financial arrangements provided security for current living expenses while building resources for long-term independence and professional development that would not be vulnerable to David's interference or retaliation. Dr. Morrison's organization provided ongoing consultation regarding security measures and risk assessment during the transition period, ensuring that my residential and professional arrangements provided appropriate protection while enabling normal activities and relationship building. The security consultation recognized that David's legal troubles might motivate retaliatory behavior that could affect my safety and required ongoing monitoring and adaptive protection measures. The professional reconstruction process focused on strengthening my relationships with colleagues and government agencies, while building new opportunities that leveraged my experience with international crisis management and cross-border coordination. My successful navigation of the abandonment crisis had demonstrated practical expertise in emergency response and international cooperation that created valuable professional credentials and networking opportunities. Margaret Chen Williams facilitated introductions to other consular personnel and international development professionals who were interested in my expertise with crisis management and cross-border educational coordination. These professional relationships provided opportunities for expanded consulting work and leadership roles that built on my demonstrated capabilities in managing complex international situations under pressure. The expanded professional network included connections with other organizations that provided services to individuals who had experienced international crises, domestic abuse, and systematic control by intimate partners. These relationships created opportunities to contribute to policy development and service improvement while using my experience to help other individuals who faced similar challenges. The American Bar Association's International Law section invited me to participate in working groups that were developing best practices for legal representation of individuals who experienced international domestic abuse and abandonment. My first-hand experience with the challenges of obtaining emergency legal services and coordinating multi-jurisdictional response provided valuable insights for improving legal protections and response procedures. The International Association of Social Workers requested my participation in training programs for professionals who worked with individuals experiencing cross-border domestic abuse and document theft. My experience with emergency response coordination and the systematic approach to building protective relationships provided practical knowledge that could help other professionals develop effective intervention strategies. These professional opportunities represented significant career advancement that had emerged from my successful navigation of David's calculated abandonment and my demonstrated expertise in crisis management and international coordination. The professional recognition validated my capabilities while providing expanded opportunities for meaningful work that contributed to protecting other individuals from similar systematic abuse. The legal proceedings continued to advance through established judicial processes, while David faced mounting evidence of his criminal behavior and systematic abuse. The comprehensive nature of the prosecution's case and the strength of the evidence made plea negotiation difficult, while ensuring that David would face substantial consequences for his calculated cruelty and criminal actions. Assistant District Attorney Vasquez maintained regular communication regarding the progression of criminal proceedings and the expected timeline for resolution through trial or plea agreement. The prosecution remained confident in the strength of their case while being prepared for extended legal proceedings if David chose to contest the charges rather than accepting responsibility for his behavior. The civil litigation advanced toward resolution through mediation and settlement negotiations that focused on appropriate financial compensation and protective measures that would ensure David could not repeat his controlling behavior or retaliate against my professional activities. Rebecca Santos structured the settlement discussions to maximize financial recovery while establishing permanent legal protections that would prevent future harassment or interference. The comprehensive legal and professional response to David's abandonment had achieved multiple important objectives that validated the effectiveness of strategic preparation and relationship building for overcoming systematic abuse. Criminal prosecution ensured appropriate accountability for David's behavior, while creating legal precedent that would protect other individuals from similar calculated cruelty. Civil litigation provided financial compensation and permanent protective measures that supported my independent reconstruction while preventing future abuse or retaliation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.